what is your guys' opinion as we move into 2023? I know there's been a lot of conversations about these tech companies being too big to fail, maybe too big to regulate, so to speak. There's a lot of CFPB complaints around, some of the big giants like PayPal and, their other company Venmo about, not responding to consumer complaints when it comes to disputing transactions, and then them passing it over to the bank, and the bank is like, well, pass it back to PayPal. What do you guys see as the industry addresses that?
Regulation is coming. It always does. Banks obviously are heavily regulated today, right? And they will continue to be, and these types of transactions will as well. What's tricky about P2P is, and really a lot of these transaction types, is unlike card, where you have Visa and MasterCard who make some rules and can, decide liability. It's the Wild West, right? Like, this is like who decides who is liable. And usually, how it ends up is, whoever doesn't have the money, right? It's now the liable party. And that is unfortunate, right? Because people are trying to follow the rules, and people are trying to, and by people I mean banks, right? They're trying to offer this service to their cardholders, or to anybody that wants to transfer money. I don't actually know how that plays out. I mean, I don't know if ultimately the government will step in and sort of mediate that in the way that networks do on the card side. There has to be rules, right? And I think at some point, if there are no rules, I do think consumers will start walking away from some of this technology. Fraud is only going to get worse, and people aren't going to want to use their money and send somebody money for a transaction when there's no guarantee that they receive whatever goods they're supposed to get, right? So that's why it makes these sorts of transactions so hard for retail, right? I mean, a lot of this P2P stuff is just people, shipping money to their buddy because for a pizza, right? Like that's what these transactions are. And if there's an expectation that this is going to grow to be a more useful global tool for retail and consumer, then there has to be some rules, and people have to feel secure, right? You can't, imagine, ordering something and paying somebody through Venmo and not getting it, and then you just, what, right? You just kind of like look at each other and like, what happened? Like, I like, what do I do now? My money's gone. So I think, if there's a real desire by the market to use these transactions in a more meaningful global payment way, there has to be some rules in place. And it's the same way I feel about crypto. I mean, I think it's fantastic, but if there are no rules about who's liable when shit goes wrong, then people won't use it, because people aren't okay with just giving their money away and not having any assurances that that they'll receive whatever good or service or product they're expecting to. So I don't know how it shakes out, but I just know that it won't grow unless there ends up being some rules around that stuff.
They're playing with crypto too. Like Venmo is offering, if you can buy crypto with
like,
your
let's
Venmo
double
balance.
down on the risky transactions, right? I mean, in the news, everybody saw issues with actual crypto exchange fraud, right? Like that's something where you're not going to see that in the banking industry because it's so heavily regulated. And there's like this pendulum effect. People run away from banks because they don't want Big Brother watching them, and then they conduct their transactions with somebody that they don't actually know, who's not regulated. They lose a bunch of money, and then they want regulation, right? I mean, you will actually probably see people asking for regulation at some point. Visa and MasterCard are kind of like this thing that like merchants don't necessarily like because they have to pay them. Banks don't necessarily like them because they have to pay them. Consumers kind of like Visa and MasterCard because they have put a system in place. Visa and MasterCard used to run a network, and they still do, obviously, and the value of a network is far less interesting these days. There's computers and networks everywhere. I'm surrounded by 700 networks right now. But the other thing they offered was the security of the transaction and dispute resolution afterwards. And And that's where, we play in that space a lot, obviously. And it's like, what happens after the transaction if something went wrong? And Visa and MasterCard have a very clear answer for that. And they even show up with money. They show up with money that comes from the merchant and the bank. And that's why, they're not super thrilled about it. But there's a process in place, and there's a way to get that money where it ultimately should go. Is there the same opportunity or the same sort of mechanism at this point that Visa and MasterCard are providing for Venmo or PayPal or Zelle or RTP or all that stuff? There's Nacha for ACH, does a serviceable job, but consumers, they will demand to be protected or they won't use it. And not only that, Visa and MasterCard are already doing this. They're right across the street. So you got to pry this card from somebody's hands, and they're starting to realize that the grass may not be greener.
Well, and Venmo and PayPal. I mean, PayPal's been doing this for a while. Venmo just launched it, but they issue these like Venmo debit cards now too. So
Right.
Interesting to
so
see
all
how
they did, right? So that's such a funny thing, because they couldn't
Whose
figure out
logo
how to
is
solve
on
this
that
problem.
card?
Yeah,
right.
I mean,
I think MasterCard is PayPal.
Of course it is.
right. And I remember, talking last year at Money 2020, or 2 years ago at Money 2020, and that was the big year, and all the crypto folks were there, and they were like, well, we're not regulated and we don't have to worry about this. And then I was talking to one CEO and founder of some crypto company, and he's like, well, what we're doing is, because our holder retail, so we're just letting them load a prepaid card. And I was like, well, yeah, now that's a card, and now you're subject to Reg E. And he was like, well, no, I'm a crypto company. And I was like, yeah, nobody cares, right? So I mean, and now like Venmo, right, doing the same thing. So here's the money loaded onto this debit card, because that's the only real way to get these funds to be used for commercial purchases. We're right back where we started, right, with card rails. And Dave and I have joked about this before, and it's like, man, all this money movement stuff, and like, I get it when you want to give somebody money quickly, but that's all that it's ever going to be good for. They're never going to solve this problem of large retail purchasing, because it's not protected. And it seems that that's how they're going to solve the problem, is they're just going to use cards, right? They're just going to use the Visa and MasterCard rails and solve it that way. And which is great for us, right? It's fantastic for us.
Yeah,
it's exactly
I don't hate
how
that
we
at
want
all.
people to be.
It's not
So-
particularly innovative,